Welcome all of you. So, after completing life cycle assessment part, next part in this course is strategic environmental assessment. So, all of you remember the environmental impact assessment part, right? It is like a mandatory requirement for EIA projects as per the 2006 notification, but then EIA is always done for a project. When there is a project, then we do the EIA, but before that project actually begins, there are a lot of things which goes into developing that project or proposing that project, and there will be a lot of strategies involved in it. So, at that moment of time, before a project starts, we need this strategic environmental assessment. It is not much common in India, but still if we go through literature, you would see that there are some nice case studies, nice projects which have employed strategic environmental assessment in addition to EIA as a part of that project. So, in today's lecture we will cover what is strategic environmental assessment, like what is the process, flow chart, what are the key steps involved in it, and how does it compare with EIA, at what stage of the project it is done, what are the benefits or what are the salient features of both the approaches. So, strategic environmental assessment, the short form SEAC. As awareness grew that environmental concerns need to be addressed in decision making above the project level, there was a need which emerged in 1980s for strategic environmental assessment. So, when you say above the project level means that the policies, the plans, the programs which they are usually adopted before a project begins, right. So, at that stage strategic environmental assessment is required. It is a systematic and proactive process used to evaluate the environmental consequences of policies, plans and programs PPPs before they are formally adopted. So, obviously because it is like a structured process just like EIA, it is a systematic process, but most important it is a proactive process. Proactive means to take precaution before something wrong happens, okay, before even like if we could visualize or foresee the consequences and accordingly if we take action beforehand, that is called a proactive approach, rather than if there has been a consequence and then we need to fix that problem by coming up with a solution, that will be a reactive approach, right. So, SEA is based on a proactive process, and whenever a project is formed, there are lots of policies, planning, programs prepared. So, these policies, plans and programs should be evaluated or should be tested for their environmental consequences before they are actually adopted to formulate a project. That is where SEA comes into picture. So, it operates at a higher strategic level than project level EIA. EIA will operate mainly at the project level. Okay. So, initially like when SEA started to be used in industries, mainly in the western countries, it was mainly thought of in terms of application of project EIA principles to PPPs, that is policies, plans and programs. So, in some sense it was not wrong because EIA principles are also very robust, but it was not a mere extension of EIA principles to policies, planning and program, but there are many more things or strategical thinking or decision making which should go into assessing the suitability of those PPPs. And with time different interpretations emerged that were connected in particular with like how SEA and EIA were like different, maybe in geographical context, maybe in the system boundary context or the application. Okay. So, different geographical and time scales of SEA and EIA. SEA and EIA need not be, they are not happening at the same stage with respect to when the project is concerned. So, there are different geographical and time scales. The amount of time required by SEA or EIA would be different. Different levels of details at strategic and project tiers. At project level there would be lot of data available to us for conducting the EIA, but at strategy level the amount of data or detail that would be available would be limited. So, the levels of detail are different. Different ways in which strategic decision processes are organized when compared with project planning. So, if you remember while we studied environmental planning part, there were different types of planning, and one of the most important planning was strategic planning. When it comes to environmental planning, it was always a strategic planning which started mainly at the top level or the executive level, then we had operational and tactical planning below that. So, that project level planning, again it deals with mainly with the project, but the ways in which these strategic decisions are taken and the processes for taking that strategic decisions are organized, based on that also SEA can be differentiated from EIA. So, if you have to see the relation between SEA and EIA, this simple graph shows it very nicely. Both are the assessment for projects which are like where environmental concerns are of importance. So, as we move from policies to planning and strategies and programs to projects, you can see the first 3 stages there is a need for SEA regulations, and at the project level EIA regulations are applied, and as we go down you can see the objectives are cascading. It means like as we go down, each level becomes more detailed and with more information. So, cascading objectives basically shows that when a policy is formulated, it gives direction to plans. When plans are finalized, it gives direction to programs, and when programs are finalized, they all together give direction or guide the projects. So, in this way decisions typically cascade from top to bottom as per this approach. So, first we should go for SEA and then for EIA for any like project which is of a major category and which would involve lot of environmental concerns as well as lot of policies and plannings and programs. So, let us look at just like we had seen EIA flowchart, the environmental clearance flowchart. There are some steps in general SEA process, and then since SEA is mainly applicable to those PPP policy plans and programs, we will have a separate flowchart for that purpose also. Now, let us look at general SEA process. What does it include and what are the stages or processes involved in each stage and what is the outcome of each stage. So, similar to EIA, SEA also starts with screening, scoping, the documentation in the report form, consultation, decision making and the monitoring. The outcome of each of this SEA stage would be, in screening stage we can like get a decision whether for a chosen or for a given project SEA is required or not. When we set the scope, we get the terms of reference like the boundary of the project, all the important terminologies in the project. Okay. Documentation, it will give us a first draft. Consultation, it can be with the stakeholders, with the public or with the executive or strategic level people, and it can give us comments and amendments for SEA. At the decision making, we will get the final SEA management plan, and at the monitoring stage, monitoring of effects will take place. And what are the processes involved in between like each stage results into some outcome. The different processes involved in each stage are like screening is determining whether proposed activity requires SEA or not. In scoping, there are a lot of things involved. So, first identify the options for this policies, plan or program. You get the details of project, do some initial assessment of literature or policies, scenarios, issues, concerns. Take some preliminary consultations and do stakeholder meetings, get their opinion, carry out surveys to fill in data gaps. So, a lot of data collection is going on in this scoping stage to know the possible options for each of them, policy, plan or program. And once that is done, in consultation or documentation phase, you do the strategic environmental assessment, cumulative impacts, find a management strategy or monitoring requirements or the implementation strategy. Then it goes to public consultation or sectoral review, followed by government review, and final review of SIA report is made to get the final decision. So, somewhat it is similar to EIA. The only thing is like EIA was more concerned about the aspects and targets and objectives of the project and the possible environmental impacts on different components of the environment, and those impacts were caused mainly by different activities carried out within a project. Here in strategic environmental assessment, the procedure is followed, but more emphasis is given on identifying the best set of policies, planning or program measures which will lead to different set of actions that would be taken for the project. So, SEA process flowchart for PPP, that is like the another version or maybe specific to the PPP, that is plan, program or policy. So, it again starts with screening followed by scoping and impact analysis of identified alternatives. Once you do the scoping, you identify the alternatives, you do the mitigation and impact management. Okay. And once that is done, the environmental report or SEA statement is released, and that can be reviewed or consulted by public. And after the review and consultation, some inputs or recommendations are obtained for decision making regarding different environmental aspects of plan, program or policy, after which there is a follow up and adaptive management, and finally monitoring or the evaluation. And once that is done, the communication or conveying the environmental impacts, that is also done. So, amongst all these stages from screening to adapt, follow up or management, public can be involved, but main stages at which public participation happens, they are scoping and review or consultation. So, those are the, that is the flow chart for a SEA based on PPP. And if you look at this right hand side, before the screening, there is a preparing a plan, program or policy, and that plan, program or policy, whether it gets accepted, approved or not, in that all these stages are involved. So, when you define the scope of PPP, you draft the PPP document, you do the decision, after review consultation there would be a decision, and finally implementation and general monitoring of the that plan, program or policy. This circular rope, it shows that while drafting the PPP or preparing the report, once we get the recommendations from public or from consultation, it can be modified. So, that continuous improvement loop, which we also saw at the heart of ISO 14001 or environmental management system, that is visible here after public consultation. So, the draft, the scope can be revised after review and consultation, so that when it goes beyond that stage at follow up and adaptive management or decision making, we have the final version. I will not say we are comparing it, but let us see how SEA can be distinguished from EIA based on different set of parameters. So, like level of application, objective, stage in planning, scope, nature of impacts and alternatives. So, as we have seen earlier, the level of application for SEA is before the project, mainly in terms of policies, plans and programs, and EIA, it is for specific development projects. Objective of SEA, to integrate environment into strategic level decision making. Objective of EIA, to assess and mitigate environmental impacts of a project. Okay, you set the boundary, you identify the list of activities associated with the project, then identify the list of components of environment which can be impacted and get the environmental impacts. Once you get those impacts, you list down the mitigation strategies, that is EIA. SEA, like while we are doing strategic level decision making for formulating plans and policies, the factor of environment must be integrated into that decision making, that is the objective of SEA. So, the stage when SEA comes in planning, it is very early before project formulation, and it follows proactive approach, unlike EIA which comes after the project concept or design is prepared, and reactive approach, like once there is activity which has an impact on environment, how do we mitigate it, that is the reactive approach followed by EIA. Nature of impacts in SEA, mostly it is indirect, cumulative and regional impacts, whereas in EIA it is a direct impact for some action and immediate impacts. Okay. It is easy to quantify and measure direct impacts, and which happens in a very short span of time, but the indirect impacts or the cumulative, it will take time and it is not easy to understand or identify them. So, it will need lot of brainstorming, lot of strategical thinking to find or actually measure those impacts. Alternatives, wide strategic alternatives, and in EIA it can be for site, technology, design alternatives, so that the environmental impact is minimized. But in terms of strategy, there would be n number of ways to think on formulating a best policy, plan or a program. So, there are wide alternatives in case of SEA, which makes it a very tedious and a difficult like decision making activity, but yeah, when it is done correctly, it can lead to a very good EIA subsequently for the same project. There are other more parameters like data requirement. In SEA we need mainly general data, the strategic like scale data, but in EIA we need detailed baseline data and measurements so that environmental impact can be calculated. Public participation in SEA is at very early stage when the project is like at the thinking stage or at the designing stage, okay, it is not finalized yet. So, broad stakeholder engagement would be there, but in EIA it can be at TOR stage, like once the project is defined or designed and it goes for scoping stage or terms of references are made, there public hearing can be done. Legal status, SE is mandatory in European Union and there are limited mandates in India, but in EIA it is legally mandatory as per EIA 2006 notification for many projects under, I think we saw those 29 or 30 discipline categories where projects mandatorily need EIA. Outcome document, it is an environmental report or SES statement. For EIA it is EIA report or environmental management plan. Decision authority can be planning ministries or agencies, whereas in EIA it is the environment associated regulatory bodies like Ministry of Environment, Forestry, Climate Change. This is for the case of India, right. Then it is state level impact assessment agency. Focus, sustainability, policy conference, whereas for EIA focus is project feasibility and impact mitigation. The time frame required for SEA is long, okay, because many times the visualization of impacts it is not so easy. So, to define the system boundary where those impacts can go, how long those impacts can go will take lot of time to get the views of community living within those areas, and then it has to be linked to the planning cycles related with the PPPs of the project. So, that takes long time, whereas EIA it has a defined time frame until the clearance is obtained. So, to summarize what we studied in this lecture was the definition of strategic environmental assessment, like why it is important above the project level, because at the project level we have EIA and it is a very robust tool to find environmental impacts, and then not only that we also propose the mitigation strategies to reduce or to manage those impacts. But the policies or the plans or the programs which lead to formulation or design of that project, whether those are done properly or not, assessment of that is involved, is done in the strategic environmental assessment. So, it comes basically before the project level. And then we saw the difference between not the difference, but the distinguishing like features of SEA and EIA, like how they are different in terms of their objective, their time frame, their scope, application, the approach, whether it is one is proactive, one is reactive, okay. And but both aim to, both are addressed towards including that environmental component in decision making. And SEA process we saw like two types of flowchart. They are similar to EIA, but specific mainly to 3 P's. So, I will stop here like with the abbreviations of these 3 P's, which is planning, policy and program. Associated with these 3 P's, the SEA process flowchart was discussed. So, thank you.